First, the north-south autobahn that ran up and down this part of Germany, dead straight. We believed that the Russians had just charged up this autobahn in their advance on Berlin itself to the north. If so, most of their forces would be fighting in Berlin, leaving the rural hinterland thinly guarded. "That's the plan," the capo said. "And after we cross the autobahn, we have to cross the railroad line, about 20 kilometers further. After that, we should find the 12th Army boys waiting for us. And then, hello, America." His finger moved across the map, the autobahn, the railroad, and then the river Elbe. I laughed in a grim way, but that only made the pain in my back sharper. In the past, I had slept easily enough in a panzer. The thin metal chair made a good perch, and you rested your head on the turret wall or on the gun breech, with your forehead on your linked fingers for a pillow. If you were in the panzer all night, a shell case was your toilet, and fresh air came from opening the hatch to empty it. In this way, 3 men could pass the night in the turret cage, and the other 2 crewmen on their seats in the hull. On that night in the woodland west of Halbe, though, I did not want to sleep. I took another mouthful of amphetamines, painkillers, and schnapps. The forest around my panther was not sleeping either. It was filled with voices, cries, the wailing of children, and the sound of equipment being readied for our next stage of the breakout. Searching for aspirin, I fumbled in my tunic pocket and found the photo of the young woman that the lady on the panther's deck had given me before she died. A grey light was coming through the cupola, and I climbed out to examine the photo more fully. The girl was a beauty, and like all lonely soldiers, I imagined that she might be good, understanding company for a man such as me. There was an address on the back, a town to the west of the Elbe, in the American-occupied sector of Germany. There was no name for the girl. I smiled and put the photo safely in my pocket again. A few birds were singing, but that stopped as the sound of bombardment grew from the countryside to our west. Close at hand, in the forest, there was more noise, shouting and cursing, and people clamouring for attention. I went into the trees to see what this was. I found a scrum of our soldiers hunched over something on the ground, in the dawn light. I pushed through them, and with the authority that came from a panzer uniform at this point in the fighting, the infantry made way for me slowly. I found that a group of German troops had found a Seydlitz man. The Seydlitz agent was pressed back against the roots of a tree, clenching his fists, gritting his teeth. His field grey uniform had a German eagle but no swastika, and one of our men handed me an armband that had been in the Seydlitz man's pocket. "In the service of the National Committee for a Free Germany." This was what the Seydlitz agents called their organisation. Looking around, I realised that the small crowd did not only contain soldiers. Various German women were present, some of them armed, and also a handful of children and youths of about 10 years to maybe 15 years of age. One of the women stepped forward and threw a rope upward over the branch of the nearest tree. An aircraft flew overhead, then another 2 planes, so low that their slipstream shook the tree canopy. I heard their cannon firing into the forest to the east, and then the slow thump of exploding vehicles from somewhere over there. With this background, the Seydlitz man was hanged on the tree, his throat emitting a dreadful rattle, while the circle of troops, youths, and women watched. His jerking, kicking heels were seized by a German boy of 10 or 12 years, who swung and pulled on them to break the Seydlitz man's neck and silence the hideous sounds that were coming from his mouth. "It is not decent," I heard the boy say to his mother, as the hanged man's feet swung around silently in a circle above us. "Such sounds are not decent in a German forest." We moved slowly out to the main path, which was already filling up with mismatched human and vehicle traffic that had entered this patch of forest during darkness, having traversed the nightmare of Halbe itself. We set our compass and aimed west. I moved ahead of the capo's panther, and together our 2 panzers advanced at walking pace, with frequent stops, in the pearlescent light of the spring morning. On our left, incendiary explosions rolled across the horizon, and from the panther's cupola I could see trees in the distant fields being blown up and set on fire by the blasts. I believed that the unit there were the remains of our 21st Division Panzer Grenadiers, holding back the Reds from our columns. At times wounded infantry would appear in the pastures near the road, limping or carrying their comrades. They told us that the line was holding over there, but the Reds were constantly probing our flanks with their panzers, infantry and Seydlitz men. The Sturmovix came over us repeatedly, so often that the air was almost never free of the scream of their engines. There was a flak gun on a broken-down half-track at one point in a copse near the road, manned by a crew of Hitler Youth, Luftwaffe men and civilian girls. This ragged crew threw off their camouflage netting and foliage and fired up at the swooping red aircraft. They managed to hit one plane, sending tracer through one wing and causing a huge plume of flame to erupt from it. The Sturmovik flipped onto its back, with metal debris streaming out in the flames in its slipstream, and crashed into the forest ahead. The victory was momentary. The following two planes spotted the flak at once and raked it with their incendiary shells, leaving the bodies of the crew burning among the barrels of their gun. In the early light, the Russian forces tested us and pushed at our lines. Our two Panthers were moving with a group of about 500 infantry and civilians who had come through Halbe with us, and we were in no condition to withstand a sustained attack from the flanks. As the sun rose, my worst fears in this respect became a reality. Through the trees, we saw that 3 Joseph Stalin panzers had appeared outside the forest, on the distant heath, patrolling across the open land and traversing their turrets as they surveyed our segment of the woodland. We immediately halted, trusting that our vehicles were screened by the trees, and we watched the Stalins as they prowled across the landscape out there. To engage them would surely bring a further detachment of Red Panzers down upon us, leading to the destruction of the few hundred people we had brought through from Halbe. Our column of foot soldiers and civilians, meanwhile, threw themselves onto the forest floor and drove their animals off among the trees. In moments, our 1,000 pairs of eyes were watching silently as the 3 Stalins moved slowly past our part of the tree line, at a distance of about 1 kilometre from us. I was inside the turret, and my gunner had his face to the gun sight, with his hand on the firing lever, his feet moving the turret fractionally to keep the Stalins in his scope. I could see the sweat dripping down the side of his neck and the quiver in his fingers as he held the lever. For a panzer commander, one immediate tactical decision in a concealment situation is whether to shut down your vehicle's engine or not. The engine, even when idling, is noisy, and if the enemy for some reason shuts off his engine, he will hear you. Or if the enemy is accompanied by an infantry screen, they will hear you if they move away from the sound of their own panzers. On the other hand, if you turn your engine off, there is the danger that it may be slow to start if you need to move away urgently, and also, without the transmission running under the turret, you can only traverse your turret slowly with the hand crank. Weighing this up, I kept the engine running, because the enemy Stalins were still some distance away, and I could see no infantry with them. As another precaution, I ordered my loader to load high explosive and have a round of armour-piercing ready in his hands. Like the T-34s against the King Tigers, I knew that the best way to deal with a bigger, heavier tank was to blow its tracks off with the first shot, and then to use a penetrating round. The 3 Stalins came closer and then halted, trailing fumes, at a range of barely 600 to 800 metres outside the trees. I swallowed. The Stalins spewed out exhaust smoke, and then continued their slow progress past us. 500 hearts were pounding in rhythm with their engines, I am sure. As they began to depart, the rearmost Stalin turned its turret to us and fired a long burst of machine gun from its coaxial along our tree line. The bullets ripped up the trees at head height and ricocheted off the hull of our Panther and then ceased. Apparently satisfied, the Stalin moved on slowly. I breathed in deep relief, but as I did so, a civilian man bolted out from the trees beside us, waving his arms in surrender. "Scheisse, he's gone mad under the pressure," my radio man said. The civilian was an elderly man, and he was followed by 2 more people, a woman and a girl, who were either seeking to surrender also or trying to restrain their relative before he gave us all away. I then saw a Wehrmacht soldier near my panzer stand up, aim with his carbine and shoot the 3 people down, one after the other. They tumbled and fell like rabbits in the long grass. I had no time for sympathy. I was watching that last Stalin. The great panzer halted and rotated its hull to face onto us. He saw the shooting, my driver said, or he saw the people running. Our luck was that bad that the Stalin commander had seen the civilians run and fall, and he wanted to know why. The Stalin fired a shot, a high explosive round which burst in the trees above and sent shrapnel and wood blasting down around us. A group of civilians was hit, and they began charging in panic out onto the heath. Several soldiers also went out with their hands raised. They were immediately cut down by the Stalin's machine gun, which swept across them at neck height, decapitating many of the men. Their headless bodies slumped down with their hands still raised. The other 2 Stalins turned front onto us and began firing their main guns into the woods also. The rounds tore open the tree line in front of us, and despite the smoke, the many people running and hiding on the edge of the forest must now have become visible. A tree crashed to earth, revealing our panther fully. In some ways, I was relieved. Now we were to fight as panzermen again, machine against machine, and not hide with the old men and the fearful women in the forest. I ordered my gunner to fire the high explosive round in the breach. Our round was laid perfectly, and it exploded just right of centre against the front plate of that Stalin which had discovered us. Through the periscope, I saw its drive wheel go spinning away, dragging the track with it. The Stalin's barrel was still lowered for its lengthy reloading, and for these few moments the red panzer was vulnerable. We fired again, with the armour piercing, and this shot struck the Stalin on the gun mantle. I saw the whole turret jerk with the concussion, as metal debris flew around the machine. The Stalin began trying to reverse, keeping its front facing to us, but its missing track meant that it moved slowly and was dragging itself at an angle. If that red driver panicked now and accelerated, the single track would slew the whole vehicle sideways and present its thinner flank armour to us. I ordered my gunner to hold fire unless this happened. Meanwhile, we advanced out of the trees, onto the flat land, to engage the enemy with freedom of movement. To my right, the Capo's Panther was firing on the other 2 Stalins, his tracer rebounding off one of them, hitting the other and deflecting from that one off into the heathland. The Capo too moved out onto the heath, halting to aim his next shot. A round from one of the Stalins hit his turret top and ricocheted off, carving a path through the trees between us. I saw that a group of our infantry were approaching those 2 Stalins from the side with Panzerfausts, and it appeared the Russian crews had not seen them. I heard my gunner grunt in anticipation, and saw that the disabled Stalin had begun to speed up, the movement turning its flank towards us. The Stalin twitched as the single track gripped the ground, and in a spray of dust it began to turn sideways on, with its big silhouette clear in the morning haze. My gunner put his shot cleanly through the lower hull, just above the running gear. For a moment the Stalin kept moving, as if the round had not penetrated, but then the turret began to traverse wildly and the whole machine began to shudder. I knew what was happening in there. The exploding ammunition in the hull was building up a blast wave of pressure which would inevitably rip the turret from the hull or split the hull itself open. No panzer ever built could withstand such internal pressures. Indeed, the Stalin's long, oblong turret suddenly rose up into the air, lifted by a flash of expanding flame, and tumbled over, spilling out the bodies of the turret crew. The hull lay juddering, sending out spirals of exploding ammunition into the morning light. Both our Panthers focused now on the 2 remaining Stalins. Those red gun barrels were elevated again, and from the traversing of their turrets I saw that they were both taking aim at my Panther. I told my driver to accelerate, out into the heath, hoping that we could move faster than their turrets could turn. At the same time, we traversed our turret rapidly onto them, finishing our short run with a slew to one side, to bring our gun more quickly around to aim at the Reds. A few seconds of shouted commands, my gunner rotating the turret a few centimetres and operating the gun elevation for his final calculations. Just as the Stalins turned their massive guns directly onto us, my gunner was able to get a shot onto the nearest one, a shot which at this close range split open the top of the turret where it joined the side. I saw the projectile exit the turret through the hatch, carrying with it parts of the crew's bodies and bits of machinery. The open hatch emitted thick smoke, and the lower hull crew began to clamber out. The other Stalin, before it could get a shot at us, was hit by a Panzerfaust. I saw our men advancing to the machine's rear, ducking as they scrambled across the scrubland from the woods. I saw the long, fiery trail of a Panzerfaust rocket, and then the explosion from the engine compartment, which sent a torrent of fuel spilling out onto the heath. That crew also climbed out of their Panzer, and in a few seconds our men had rounded up half a dozen of these Russian crewmen, standing around them with their guns trained on them while our two Panthers drove back to the road through the forest. We had won this small battle against great odds, but the smoke from the burning Stalins was marking our position clearly even in the morning mist, and for every Stalin that we destroyed, 5 could come to take its place. As we regained the road, with the Capo's Panzer in front, I saw that our infantry were shooting the captured Red crewmen, cutting them down one by one with single rounds. Then our men searched the bodies, removing what appeared to be cigarettes and items of food. Our troops had descended this low, scavenging scraps from enemy corpses. I told my driver to make the fastest possible speed on this narrow, uneven road. It was imperative that we get away from that scene urgently. I went up through the hatch and looked around. The 500 or so infantry and civilians were forming up behind us, hobbling, limping, or walking in our wake. If I expected congratulations on our rapid battle, none were forthcoming. The wounded were in their own world, and the civilians were ashen-faced and trembling. The mist overhead began to burn off in the sunlight. In a few minutes, the bombing began again, with Sturmovix passing overhead and dropping bombs at random through the leaf cover. I stood on the rear deck as wounded men and exhausted civilians began to drag themselves up on board, and I considered the state of the Panther. We had fuel for another 20 kilometres at best. The transmission was almost worn out. The engine was running hot, and the tracks needed to be removed, tightened, and their connecting pins checked, a procedure that would take half a day under normal circumstances. Our main gun ammunition was down to a handful of rounds, with almost none left for the machine guns. Our radio had stopped functioning properly, and we had no fire extinguisher or spare oil. The superb slab-sided Panther kept rolling west at a walking pace, but for how much longer? This road passed through an area where the Russians had fought running battles with our forces in the days before. The forest was strewn with wrecked vehicles, both German and Russian. We passed a series of German ambulance vans, in which each of the wounded men had been shot in the head. The discovery gave renewed impetus to our column's march, as our two panzers and then the infantry and foot followers filed past the human remains, even as our loader jumped down to tap the vans for any possible fuel. We stopped at any intact vehicles that we found to check them for fuel in the tanks, but somebody had been through the area ahead of us and drained every drop. There was a T-34 still in one piece, surrounded by the bodies of its crew. But the Russian panzers ran on diesel, not gasoline, and that fuel would cause our Maybach engines to foul up. The need for gasoline was becoming desperate, and preying on my mind as much as the explosions from aircraft and artillery which echoed around us. Around midday, in a clearing which was untouched by the battles, we came upon a remarkable thing. It was a Panther. The Panzer was stationary, halted among the ferns, apparently undamaged. It appeared to be virtually new, its paint unchipped and its tracks perfectly tensioned, with no mud or debris in them. Its hatches were closed and its gun was level. We halted and observed it for a minute. There was no sign of life. I walked across to the Capo's Panzer, climbed up among his wounded and discussed this with him. No markings or signs, the capo said, squinting at the beautiful, unmarked panther in the dappled light. It's just been abandoned, perhaps. Maybe it ran out of fuel. But then why did the crew not blow it up with the demolition charge? Maybe the crew surrendered or were killed outside the vehicle, I said. It could be full of gasoline and ammunition. It might start at the first try. The capo looked at me. You suggest leaving your panther and taking that panther? Or putting our radio man in that one. He can drive well enough, and he has no radio or gun ammunition anyway. We can pick up more Panzer crewmen along the road. Then we will have a force of 3 Panthers. The capo rubbed his chin. But who would leave a Panzer there like that? It looks like a red trick to me, as if they captured a Panther and then left it here as a trap. Let me take a look, Herr Leutnant. Be very quick and be careful. I went over to the Panther and looked around it. I could see no cables or tripwires, and the ground appeared undisturbed. The machine looked the way that my machine used to, pristine, well-maintained, and very potent. I climbed up onto it and tried the commander's hatch. It slid to one side easily. I waited for a few seconds. There was an explosion which sent a torrent of fire up into the air to a height of 20 meters. I could hear debris flying around inside the Panzer as its ammunition detonated, and then, as I jumped clear and ran, the fuel tanks blew up with a force that suggested they had been completely full. I stumbled as a fireball rose over the Panther, and it was covered in burning gasoline. As I picked myself up, the capo laughed and ordered us to move on quickly. "You thought it was Christmas morning, Faust," he shouted at me. "You thought the Reds gave you a new Panther, but the Reds know how to set a trap, that's for sure." We left the magnificent Panther burning there as the trees around it caught fire, and the Sturmovik aircraft overhead began to swarm towards the smoke. In the late afternoon, our road converged with several other tracks in an area of oak trees dotted with small houses inside the forest. The narrow roads were crammed with traffic and people, all heading west towards the north-south Autobahn. Basic military discipline had broken down in this area. There was nobody directing the traffic, and panzers, half-tracks, motorcycle combinations and cars all scraped alongside each other as the final single road had to take all of the vehicles and people. The forest was dense overhead, but to either side was more open country, and we could hear the sound of fighting from left and right as the troops on the flanks fought to keep the narrow route open. I began to see, among the roadside bushes, small shapes that fluttered in the breeze and trailed long threads. These were the epaulettes, shoulder badges and collar insignia of officers and NCOs who did not want to be captured with the enemy knowing their rank, and they had torn their markings off and thrown them away. Almost all of these were the badges of regular Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe troops, gleaming dully in the light. I saw a few SS markings strewn by the roadside too, the skull badge or the collar flashes that would identify them as the Russians' worst enemies. However, most SS men were identifiable by their high-quality camouflage uniforms or by their forearm tattoos which contained their blood group. For the SS, the only choice was to get to the west. The alternative was simply death. For years they had sown destruction in the east, and now the enemy had them in an iron claw. Slowly we made our way towards the western edge of the forest and the great Autobahn road beyond. We managed to take some gasoline from a stranded truck full of Luftwaffe officer cadets, and we had to hold these boys back at gunpoint while we poured their cans of fuel into our panzers to gain another 10 kilometers of movement. This was the law of the Kessel. He who could take what he needed had to take it. The Luftwaffe cadets stood cursing and swearing vengeance on us as we left them behind. As we approached the edge of the trees, a rocket bombardment began to smash into the rear of our column. The Katyusha rockets tore down through the oaks, smacking from one great trunk to another, setting the branches on fire and raining a burning liquid down onto the people there. It was essential that we leave this forest, or everyone here would be consumed within hours. From the front of the column, an SS Panzer man came running beside the road, calling for all panzers or armour to move to the front. Behind him, a squad of SS infantry was moving along the road, pushing all unarmoured vehicles or foot traffic to one side to let the panzers through. The capo's Panther and mine made our way forward in answer to the call, crushing cars or carts which had not been moved aside. We even had to bulldoze aside a complete 80mm gun, which was stuck on its trailer in a crater, blocking the path. Behind us, from out of the smoke of the burning trees, there appeared a convoy of Hetzers, the little self-propelled tracked guns that were fast and low, lightly armoured but useful to have in any situation. It was amazing to think that the complete Hetzer vehicle, at barely 16 tons, weighed less than the turret on a King Tiger, which I believe weighed 18 tons. How many more Hetzers could Germany have built for the cost of the 500 King Tigers which we produced in total in our factories? 2,000 Hetzers, or 3,000? What effect would this have had on the war? Such questions can lead to all manner of calculations and alternatives. We were joined also by a Panzer IV of a tank training regiment, crewed by youths led by an experienced NCO, who stood in his turret hatch in an old-style black panzer tunic as if he was rolling into Poland at the start of this whole war. With this clutch of vehicles, we moved up to the head of the column and dispersed among dense trees along the edge of an old gravel quarry. The quarry was full of wounded who were set out on the ground among the stones, and these men called to us pitifully not to leave them behind. I turned my head away and tried to shut out the sounds as we panzer crews assembled with the SS men and moved quickly to the edge of the forest itself. 3 King Tigers were concealed here, their massive outlines shrouded in nets and branches. These were not the vehicles we had come through Halbe with, but from the 10th SS Panzers, which was reduced to this number as its entire strength. The unit was commanded by a Waffen-SS major with a bandage around his head and burn marks on his face. The SS had grim, clenched faces, as befitted men who were seeking to escape certain death at the hands of their captors, and their dilated, darkened eyes suggested that they were drawing strength from their supplies of cognac and amphetamine. The SS had set up a binocular periscope here, and through it we could survey the edge of the woods, a short stretch of land, and then a dark ribbon cutting through the landscape from north to south. "That is the Autobahn," the SS major said. "Beyond that there is the railroad and then the 12th Army." "Where are the Reds?" the capo asked him. "There is less bombardment out there in the open." "I think the Reds are waiting," the SS man said. "They came up this road on their way to Berlin 3 days ago. Almost all their forces are centred there to the north, but they must expect we will break out somewhere here. We captured a Red officer this morning who told us that they are bringing more armoured units down the Autobahn from Berlin tonight. They plan to fortify the Autobahn and make sure that nobody can cross it. See, the Autobahn goes through a cutting which would be perfect to defend. If the Reds build up in strength there, we will never get past this point." "Where is this prisoner?" the capo asked. "He is dead now. The information is accurate. We made sure of that." The SS man lit a cigarette. He grinned suddenly. "American cigarettes," he explained. "I have a contact who acquired a whole truckload in the Ardennes. Here, have one. Everybody have one." A red Jarbo flew over the tree line, firing rockets to the right of us. Nevertheless, we all took a cigarette and inhaled the smoke. The tobacco was fresh and fragrant in a way that I remembered from my first cigarette before the war. It was rich and— what was the word? "Quality," one of the Hetzer men said. "This is quality tobacco." "This is what life is like under the Americans," the SS major said, "and the Americans will need men such as us to rebuild this country. I don't know about you, but I can speak some English." He did not flinch as more red planes screamed overhead, firing cannon through the trees. Empty cannon shell cases from these planes fell through the branches and landed around us. "What is the plan for crossing the Autobahn?" the Panzer IV man asked. I assume that with your heavy panzers, you will be in the lead. Yes, the Major nodded, looking us all in the eye. We will cross at dusk. My 3 King Tigers will go out and cross first. We will hold open the way for the columns behind us. He gestured with his cigarette into the forest. For all these columns to cross the Autobahn. But we also need screening panzers to move north and south of the crossing point. Those panzers will prevent enemy armour from approaching and disrupting the crossing. I want the 3 Hetzers and 1 Panther to the south, and the Panzer IV and the other Panther to the north, each grouped along the Autobahn cutting. My SS Panzer Grenadiers will accompany you, and there are still infantry units in the columns who will fight. Some of the civilians are well armed now, so they can be useful to us as well. In this way we will open the crossing, and in darkness our whole columns can cross at speed. After that, we must drive west without stopping. I repeat, we will not stop. You must keep up, or be left behind for the Russians. He grinned suddenly. And then I will see you on the Elbe. We will be prisoners, but we will have plenty of cigarettes, my friends. The capo stood on the edge of the gravel quarry, staring down at the doomed wounded on their grimy blankets. Men who knew they were being abandoned. 2 more battles, he said. The Autobahn and then the rail line. For me, there is no choice in the matter. I must not be taken prisoner by the Reds. My family are in the West, and any future that I have is in the West. I cannot do 10 or 20 years in a Soviet prison in Siberia. I cannot do it. And if we are wounded, that is a risk I shall take. Look, Faust, if you want to stay back, if you want to surrender or cross the Autobahn with the column behind us, that is understandable. The war is almost over, and I cannot force you to fight. See here, look at all this. He pointed to a tree on the edge of the quarry. A large number of German insignia had been thrown here, hundreds of epaulettes and collars dangling in the breeze. Among them were many German tunic badges of the eagle with the swastika. The broad silver wings of the eagle were fluttering idly among the leaves, trailing their ripped-off threads, the myriad swastikas discarded like omens of bad luck. You see, it is over, the capo said, but my life must not be over, for the sake of my children. For you, Faust, perhaps it is different. You have no family, do you? I took from my pocket the crumpled photograph of the unknown girl that had been with me from my first day in the Kessel and showed it to him. I will come with you to the West, I said. You're a strange fellow, Faust. You're half killer and half romantic. Thank you, sir. I took an amphetamine tablet and swallowed it down with a gulp of schnapps, and finally squeezed the last of an ampule of morphine into my mouth and swallowed that. I waited a few seconds for the combined effect to hit me. I jumped onto the turret as if I was weightless and took command of the Panther through the headphones. In the side of my vision I could see the massed ranks of the abandoned wounded lying in the quarry floor, and I forced myself not to look at them. The headphones on my ears blocked out, partly, the sound of their cries. Before my engine started, I heard, nevertheless, a series of single shots, the impacts coming one after the other at irregular intervals. I could not stop myself looking back. Some of the wounded troops were committing suicide. A pistol was passing from one hand to another, being fumbled among the blood-stained clothing. The men's desperate open mouths sought the muzzle of the gun, like so many helpless chicks seeking their food. I was to seal off the southern Autobahn with the 3 Hetzers and a mobile flak on a Femo half-track, which had a quadruple 20mm cannon. This was quite a strong group of vehicles for such a task, and we were accompanied by 2 Hanemags of SS Panzer Grenadiers who would act to secure the crossing, and then be replaced by Wehrmacht as the SS moved west. All in all, this was a respectable battle group, and I felt confident that we could hold the crossing open in the early stages, provided that more armour came up from inside the Kessel as the night progressed. We moved out towards the Autobahn as the sun set. The western sky, towards which we were striving with such hope, was streaked with red. The land around the road was scattered with the debris of the Russians' advance north to Berlin, which had cleaved our forces in two and sealed the Kessel from the west in the preceding days. A ruined T-34 and a Panzer IV were jammed together, burned out and wrecked. A Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft lay on its back, its two pilots dead in the glass cabin. Shell craters were filled with the bodies of Soviets, Wehrmacht and civilians, their jumbled faces staring up with a waxen pallor. As soon as our tracks bit into the dry ground here and threw up dust, an aircraft appeared in the sky overhead. This was a Russian lame duck type, the little biplanes used for spotting and nuisance bombing. Our flak vehicle drove it away with bursts of tracer which spiraled up luminously in the grey light, but not before the plane had dropped a white parachute flare marking our location. In this sinister glow, I saluted the capo as his Panther and the old Panzer IV moved off to guard the northern flank of the crossing point, while I moved south with the Hetzers. As soon as we approached the Autobahn itself, we came under fire from the far side. A red tracer round flashed from a clump of trees and hit the Hetzer which was next to me. The range was less than a kilometre, and the force of the round lifted the whole top of the Hetzer's body from the hull, sending it up into the air in front of me. The little vehicle caught fire immediately and continued rolling forward for some distance with its crew burning within the open hull. My gunner responded to the attack with a high explosive round which blew aside some of the trees where the enemy was located. I could make out a huge block-shaped machine equipped with a massive gun, an SU tank destroyer. These colossal machines were nothing more than mobile steel fortresses, but their battleship guns could be fatal to any panzer in their path. To my north, the two SS King Tigers broached the Autobahn and came to a halt straddling the Black Road and its lines of wreckage. They engaged the SU at a range of about 1.5 kilometres, firing together across the plain. In moments, the SU was hit with a strike that knocked its massive gun mantle off to one side, and smoke began to coil from its hull. With the two remaining Hetzers, my Panther II came onto the Autobahn, and we positioned ourselves along it with the Panther on the left, and the two surviving Hetzers staggered on the right. Our two Hanomags of SS men leapt from their transports and took up positions beside the road, with heavy machine guns and Panzerfausts. Dusk was gathering, but overhead the drifting parachute flare cast a light similar to dawn. Fortunately, a strong breeze was carrying it away from us to the southwest. I surveyed the long, straight Autobahn through the cupola periscopes, trusting to the King Tigers on my right to guard our rear as they broke through the red lines. The landscape was being lit by flashes and bursts of fire as they engaged the armour they were encountering. I took a quick look in that direction, and with the drugs affecting my mind, I was transfixed at what I saw. On the great open plain, one King Tiger stood out in the glow of dusk, silhouetted against the skyline. It was immobilized, with its massive tracks twisted around, and one drive wheel lying beside it. Unmoving, though, it continued to fire as its comrade Tiger moved ahead, covering the other Tiger against a group of SU destroyers which were approaching. The immobile Tiger crew seemed determined to use all their ammunition, and were shooting at a rapid pace, again and again, each shot illuminating the huge, doomed machine. I saw one of its rounds streak across the plain and blow the hatches off one of the SU machines. The red destroyer emitted a pall of smoke and tipped into a crater, spinning around to expose its flank. The Tiger pierced it through the side with another round, which exited upward through the engine grills and rose perhaps 100 metres into the air, the tracer still glowing. The crew of that SU began to clamber out, but they were caught by a horizontal burst from one of our flak half-tracks, cutting them to pieces where they stood. The King Tiger engaged in a death duel with the two remaining SU guns. The Reds slowly shot the great Panzer to pieces, one round knocking off its running gear and causing the wheels to spin wildly over the ground. Another shell exploded on the turret, sending the cupola off into the air. Still the King Tiger kept firing, as its comrade Panzer pushed forward to the west, shooting up the resistance that it was encountering there. The stricken Tiger, wreathed in smoke and with its wheels and tracks destroyed, fired on, immobilizing one of the SUs by exploding a high-explosive shell low on its front plate. I could see the SU's drive wheels spinning, but the tracks were separated and it was unable to move. The other destroyer shot up our King Tiger with slow, repeated rounds, one that hit the front plate and deflected off, then another which hit the gun mantle and deflected down onto the hull in a puff of metal fragments. The SU prowled to the flank of the Tiger, even as our Panzer sought to traverse its turret onto the enemy. 2 final shots blew off the Tiger's engine covers, sending burning gasoline over the hull, and then punched a hole clean through the side of the turret. The Tiger's hatches flew off in trails of sparks. One lone crewman climbed out and stood for a moment on top of the turret as the flames spread over the Panzer around him. Then the whole machine erupted in a flash of gasoline flames and sent out a ragged starburst of detonating ammunition and fuel. Behind it, a dark mass of German infantry began to pour across the Autobahn, so many that the SU destroyer could only stand and fire at the living column. Infantry moved towards the monster, those men remaining brave enough to take on a red Panzer, determined perhaps to destroy this one by bombs or Panzerfausts. Herr Feldwebel, in front of us. I had been negligent. In my drugged state, I had been mesmerized by the sight of the doomed King Tiger that I had taken my eyes away from the Autobahn to the south. In the gathering dusk, but lit by the parachute flare drifting west, a number of machines were advancing on us along the dead straight asphalt road. These were T-34s, I was sure, with the sloped front plates and bulbous turrets of the 85mm gun type. They were about 1 kilometre from us, but starkly outlined as the flare dropped to earth behind them, showing up their exhaust fumes. To make up for my error, I was determined to be the first to knock one out, but I also saw the 2 Hetzers in front of me twitch from side to side as their drivers lined up the turretless machines with the track differential, to align and aim their short 75mm guns at the enemy. I glanced at our ammunition rack below the turret. It held barely a dozen rounds of armour-piercing in all, and half a dozen high-explosive, plus 1 round in the breech and 1 in the loader's brawny hands. I told the gunner to fire when he was sure of a strike. The Russian panzers fired first while still moving, and we took an impact on our front plate which rang through the hull with a deafening echo. Another round went straight past us, towards the mass of infantry behind who were breaking out across the Autobahn, and a third slammed into one of the empty SS Hanomags, splitting open the half-track and sending it spinning over on its roof, trailing flames. My gunner fired, and the tracer flew directly onto the leading red Panzer. There was a puff of debris on its turret front, and then the whole machine, travelling at perhaps 30 kph, spun around on its axis with flames shooting from its hull hatches. With its ammunition exploding, it reared up and ploughed off the Autobahn, crashing into a culvert and shuddering with explosions. Behind it, though, a whole pack of T-34s were taking its place, the lead ones firing as they raced towards us, and the ones behind, I could just make out as the parachute flare died away, loaded with infantry holding on behind the turrets. I shouted orders to my gunner. With such a pack of armour coming directly towards us, we were a stable firing platform shooting at targets which were getting constantly closer and larger, rather than moving laterally. The T-34s perceived us through their sights in the same way, but their rolling motion, even over the flat surface of the Autobahn, impaired their firing accuracy. They were obviously well stocked with ammunition, though, and kept firing as they advanced, each shot causing a slipstream of smoke through which the panzers charged on us. They had not seen the Hetzers beside the road, I realised, and in a second our 2 small destroyer machines opened fire with their 75mm guns. The range was less than 500 metres, and their combined shots blew the tracks off one T-34, causing it to veer sideways and collide with its comrade. That second red Panzer was carrying a squad of troops on its rear, and I saw the soldiers being thrown off by the impact, tumbling onto the asphalt, while the T-34s that followed simply drove over their bodies without slowing or swerving. The tiny size of the Hetzer was its greatest strength, low and compact, difficult to see in the dusk, but with enough punch to halt a T-34 in its tracks. The Red Panzers began to fire high explosive at the points where the Hetzers were concealed, trying to flush them out. As they did so, they slowed down to steady their aim. Inside the Panther turret, seconds passed in a fog of explosive fumes and sweat, breathing and cursing, as my gunner laid his aim. Then the turret reverberated with the shot, and the shell case clunked into the collection box even as our round travelled straight into the driver's visor of a leading Russian Panzer. I had been a driver myself, and I knew the damage that would cause. The decapitated hullman, the red-hot fragments smashing around the interior, slicing and setting fire to whatever it hit. That T-34 slowed suddenly, its rear deck rising up into the air and then crashing down as the panzers behind it steered around the wreck. They closed up in front of it, and we had to fire again. We wasted a valuable round, which bounced off a T-34 turret and smashed into another T-34 which was carrying infantry. These troops were knocked off the tank as the deflecting shell cut through them, and again the panzers behind ran straight over the men as they fell onto the road. But where they died, it seemed that more Red Panzers carrying troops closed the gap. It seemed that even if every last round of ours found its mark, it would never be sufficient to hold back the red numbers charging against us. This was the force that we had provoked with our attack on the east, a force with endless resources, endless men, and an endless desire for vengeance. This was what we had created, and this was what would destroy us now, us and the thousands of people swarming across the Autobahn behind us. We fired again and took a hit on our turret that smashed onto the gun mantle and made the breech of our 75mm twitch in the impact. I heard the round deflect downward and hit the top of the hull over the hull crew's head. The driver and radio man heard it too and let out a stream of relieved curses as the shell failed to penetrate the armour above them. The Red Panzers were on top of us then, literally driving into us, and a vicious, confused battle erupted in our sector of the Autobahn, while the Kessel's occupants flooded across the road only a few hundred metres behind us. That was the Reds' objective, clearly, to smash through us and cause havoc among the foot traffic streaming out of the Kessel at last. My vision in the periscope was filled with the front turret of a T-34 that rammed straight into us, trying to bulldoze us aside. The impact made our entire hull recoil, but the Red Panzer came off worse, being thrown to one side, its turret and hull pointing away from us. My driver rotated us onto that Panzer with the differential, while my gunner was lowering the gun elevation, and we fired at a range of barely 10 metres. I saw the shot punch through the back plate of the Soviet Panzer, splitting open the armour there so that I could see the engine flashing with fire in its bay. Then the round exited out of the front of the T-34 and spun away. What carnage had it caused inside? How many broken limbs and ripped bodies? The T-34 shuddered once and went still, starting to burn from the engine. Chaos was erupting around us. Someone had fired off red flares, and the lurid crimson light showed up the landscape like a new sunset. The T-34s had found the Hetzers in their emplacements and were intent on destroying them. We fired on one Red Panzer as it tried to crush a little Hetzer under its tracks, with the big Russian treadlinks scrabbling wildly on the Hetzer's roof, ripping off its hatches. Our round went through the exposed lower plate of the Red, and pieces of its hull sides were thrown off as the Panzer exploded with the Hetzer still trapped beneath it. Other T-34s had halted to disembark their infantry, and these riders were leaping off, outlined clearly in the red light, and surging past us towards the crossing point in our rear. The Waffen-SS men rose from their positions and confronted them, and although I could not hear the shouts over the din inside my Panther, I glimpsed Russian faces contorted with rage at finding the hated SS troops in their way. I saw a group of SS men firing from behind the remaining Hetzer, calmly operating a MG-42 held over one man's shoulder, tearing down the Red infantry line as it charged onward. The Russians were cut to pieces where they ran, but a T-34 blew up both the Hetzer and the MG team with repeated rounds of high explosive. The tank destroyer was blown onto its side, crushing the SS men around it, its tracks running at speed as its transmission raced wildly. Blazing gasoline exploded from its rear deck and flooded the ground for many meters. We were isolated now, with just our Panther and a handful of Panzer Grenadiers against the red mass, against a remaining trio of T-34s racing past us in the light of the flares, intent on smashing the Kessel breakout. One Ivan Panzer was hit in the side by a Panzerfaust as it rolled forward, which blew open the front hull and caused an explosion that sent the tracks whirling into the scarlet-tinted air. The troops that fired that rocket were immediately crushed under the next red Panzer, which ran them over and sent their bodies shooting out, dismembered, from the rear of its tracks. We hit the second T-34 with an armour-piercing round as it moved away from us, knocking a great scab of armour from its turret. Inside, I could see through the periscopes the red crew flailing as their compartment caught fire, the men struggling to climb from the turret but falling back into the flames. The last T-34 spun around to face us, opting to finish my Panther before advancing on the crossing site. We fired first, but our round deflected off his front plate and disappeared into the air. His shot on us hit my radio man's gun point in the hull, where the ball-mounted MG-34 was located under a curve of armour plate. My radio man screamed and then went silent, and before we could afford the time to attend to him, we fired on the T-34 at a range of 20 metres, putting a round between the gun mantle and the turret ring. The turret jolted and the guns slumped. The hull hatch opened and sparks shot out. I could see that the Panzer was burning inside, and in a moment 2 crewmen came out of the hatch, one after the other, their uniforms on fire, but armed with a drum-cylinder machine pistol. My sight of that was obscured by a human face, close up, right against the cupola periscope. It was an Asiatic, Mongolian-type face, and in the red light it was twisted into a mask of absolute hatred. Red infantry were climbing onto us, even as we fought their panzers. I ordered the driver to reverse, and as we lurched backward, I saw the Russian soldier's face disappear as he was thrown off the Panzer in the momentum. I caught sight of his tumbling legs as he went, and then a flash as his grenades exploded on the ground. Our engine stalled, and the Panther filled with foul smoke, so thick that we could barely see across the turret. Smoke coiled around the outside too, making external vision through the periscopes impossible. I threw aside the cupola hatch and put my shoulders up into the air. The red fighters were all around us, and the SS men were grappling with them, fighting them to the death. I saw an SS man beat down 2 red tank crews with an entrenching spade, then seize their machine pistol and turn it on the other Russian infantry. The SS man was blown apart by a grenade, and the Reds swarmed on towards the breakout point. Below me, in the smoke-filled hull, my driver was trying to restart the engine. There was no sound at all from the radio man. I saw some of the Red infantry begin to retreat, followed by tracer and grenade flashes. Our men in the crossing point were beating them back, forcing them away from the thousands of people on foot hurrying across the road. One Red soldier was pursued by 2 civilians, who shot the man down with a shotgun and a rifle, then stood over him and searched his pockets rapidly. Another wounded Russian dragged himself away, unarmed, until a civilian woman chasing after him shot him in the back with a pistol. All across the ground between us and the exodus over the Autobahn, such scenes were taking place, as the last of this initial Red attacking force was wiped out by the desperate Germans of all classes and arms. The crossing point had been kept open. Our engine started and we rotated the hull again to face the southern Autobahn, where I expected more enemy panzers to appear. We opened all the hatches to ventilate the compartment, and then I shouted down for a report on our radio man. There was no answer, so I climbed down under the turret ring and craned my neck through the forward bulkhead to see the situation in the front hull. On the left, the driver was green-faced, holding his head up to the open hatch and gulping in mouthfuls of outside air. On the right, across the bulkhead, the radio man was sprawled in his seat with his head thrown back. A piece of the T-34's armour-piercing round had entered the compartment through his machine gun port, destroying his gun mounting, and had come to a halt within the radio man's chest. His whole rib cage was torn open, and inside, I realised as I leaned over to see, a fragment of the conical projectile was embedded through his back into the steel bulkhead behind him. I opened the hatch above his head and asked the men to help me remove his body from the Panzer. The force that came to relieve us was not impressive. It consisted of a pair of Stugs, one with smoke pouring from its exhausts, a Panzer IV, and a single Panther. These were to guard both the north and south borders of the crossing point, together with two 88mm guns towed by half-tracks and about 100 infantry. In a few hours, these units too would join the exodus west and be replaced by units from further back in the pocket, until the entire mass of men, civilians and machines in the Kessel crept westward like a caterpillar, coiling itself up one step at a time and then uncoiling as it moved. The mass of people and material moving across the Autobahn was colossal. In any minute, several hundred men, women and children would emerge from the shadows of the heath, bunch up on the edge of the road, look quickly left and right as if checking for traffic, and then dash across, disappearing off towards the railroad line in the distance. The sparks and glow of exhausts moved among them, as motorcycles, half-tracks, and the few remaining cars and trucks made the crossing too. The Reds did not attack this point immediately with panzers or troops, but they began a bombardment which burst in slow, random patterns across the Autobahn, scattering groups of people or sending vehicles flying end over end. Nobody knew where the next explosion would fall, or whether they would be the next to be hit, or if they would die or be left behind as wounded, like the many injured troops and civilians who were lying in the shadows on the grassland, crying out not to be abandoned. Our Panther rejoined the Capo's Panther and the solitary Panzer IV. The old Panzer Ford was screeching as it moved and fell behind us slowly, as its power began to fail. As we moved away from the road, I looked back and saw the Panzer being swallowed in the ranks of people trudging past it. Where once they would have climbed up on it, begging for a ride, now they seemed to know that the vehicle was crippled, and they ignored it in their trek to the west. The Panzer IV commander, the old Panzer training man, came running after us, flagging us down. "My fuel!" he shouted. "We have no spare fuel," I called down. "I have barely enough for 10 kilometres. "But I have plenty," he shouted. "I have a full tank." We began to reverse back to his machine. The story was an interesting one. His training unit had been equipped with panzers which had been adapted to run on wood-burning carbon monoxide stoves instead of gasoline. But for several months, gasoline had continued to be delivered, and they had amassed a small reserve. We quickly pumped out every drop of fuel from the Panzer IV tanks and split it between the Capo's Panther and mine. It was not a large amount, but increased our range from 10 kilometres to 50 kilometres, enough in a straight line to cross the railroad and reach the Elbe. That was provided that we had no detours, climbed no hills, and made no bursts of speed in combat. I let the Panzer IV's trainee panzer crew ride on my Panther's front plate, where the angle meant that only able-bodied people can hold on, and we took several walking wounded and civilians onto the hull top and deck. I put the training instructor himself in the empty radioman's compartment, crouching on the shattered seat with an MP40 and instructions to fire it through the broken gun mounting if needed. He seemed pleased enough with the arrangement. Then we headed west in the semi-darkness, among the stumbling foot columns and the random explosions of the shells. My gunner rested his face on the gun sight and went still. I suspected he was asleep, but I thought that he deserved it. I stood up in the cupola as we swayed over the heathland. I could see no sign of a counterattack by the Reds, although we were on the left flank and the land in that direction was empty and open. That did not make me confident. On the contrary, it was as if the Russians were now allowing us to break out from the Kessel, permitting us to stream out into the western plain. But what choice did we have? The Kessel was a trap, a noose. If this open land was another trap, it had not yet snapped shut. In the darkness, which was broken only by the flash of explosions and fires, accidents happened. We passed a motorcycle that had been run over by a panzer, the rider and the machine visible for one instant in the light of a shell burst, mangled together in the ground. Any functioning motor vehicle that stopped was set upon and stripped of remaining fuel and ammunition. In this situation, with the scarcity of gasoline, horses were becoming more valuable. From my turret I saw a pair of Wehrmacht troops descend on a civilian 2-horse cart, cut the traces and make off riding the horses, leaving the civilians to continue on foot. A senior Luftwaffe officer whose staff car had broken down threatened the driver of a horse-drawn field kitchen with a pistol, demanding a horse for himself. The officer was quickly disarmed by passing troops, and he began to make his way among the civilians, holding a suitcase. We passed a few isolated heathland houses, in some cases with occupants standing in the doorways, watching us mutely. In the light of the flares and burning vehicles along the road, we saw that some of these houses had fresh graves near them, and it was said that these were graves of civilians who had been killed by the Russians as they passed through in the days before. In the distance, to the front, there were flashes and coils of tracer erupting into the sky, which I believed marked the point where the SS King Tigers were spearheading the movement to the west. As we grew closer, the movement of people faltered and slowed, as the vast bulk of the infantry were unwilling or unable to progress into combat. Many troops simply lay on the ground in the shadows, waiting for others to go forward and take part in the fighting for the advance. Among these were many officers who stood sullenly like children, their arms folded, refusing to give orders or to discipline their men. The civilian women mocked and cursed these officers, calling out that their menfolk had fought like true Germans. Indeed, it became common to see armed groups of civilian women wearing helmets and clutching carbines or Russian machine pistols, seeming determined to defend themselves and their children to the last. Leaving these miserable scenes behind, my panther approached the head of the column, closer to the sounds of firing and explosions. The capo's panther was just in front of me, and following his exhausts, we entered a plateau crossed by ditches and hedgerows, which we in the panzers avoided carefully for fear of losing a track. In the dim light, we halted at a group of panzer crews, standing around a Jagdtiger, one of the massive self-propelled guns built on the King Tiger platform. The huge vehicle, like a bunker on tracks, was immobilized, emitting thick smoke, and men were siphoning off its remaining fuel. The panzer crews greeted us with blank faces. By this stage, there were no salutes and formalities, and the distinctions of rank were being lost. There was little interest, too, in the differences between the original units or regiments that we had come from. We were all there at that point in time, and we had to combine to maximize our chances of the breakthrough. "You have 2 Panthers," one of them said to us. "You will be useful. The railroad is ahead, but there's a blockade in front of it. If we can get over the railroad here, we drive straight on to the west. I know definitively that the 12th Army is there, after the railroad, waiting for us. We have had messengers coming through, confirming this, but if we wait here, the Reds will simply destroy us at daylight." "But why attack the blockade itself?" the capo asked. "Why not bypass it?" "To the north and south are anti-tank ditches and flooded canals. These are things that our forces prepared to hold back the Russians, and now the Russians are using them. There are red panzers hidden up and down there too. We could find a way through all that, but it would take hours, and by then the sun will be up. As soon as daylight comes, the red planes will cut us to pieces. The blockade is not our construction. The Soviets have built it in the past few days. Therefore we believe it is a rushed piece of work, possibly not finished. We must break through it now." As we moved up to the front, the Jagdtiger was destroyed with a demolition charge. That massive machine, the equivalent of 2 Panthers in steel and resources, was simply left burning beside the road. The forces for attacking the railroad were our 2 Panthers, a remaining King Tiger, several Stugs, and some mobile 20mm flak panzers, which we called the Wirbelwind. These remarkable machines were quadruple 20mm cannon in open turrets on a Panzer IV chassis, suitable for strafing ground targets as well as anti-aircraft fire. Their presence gave me confidence, but the sight of the infantry that was to accompany us was worrying. We had several dozen Fallschirmjäger, the elite forces that we could trust to give their all. But they were supplemented with Volkssturm men and boys, the under-16s and over-50s, armed with Panzerfausts and carbines, completely untrained. There were several civilian police units too, and groups of panzer troops with no vehicles, artillerymen and flak gunners who had abandoned their guns in the breakout. Regular Wehrmacht troops were there, and a pioneer officer brought in another 50 or so from the column at gunpoint, ordering them to fight or face instant execution. This officer was backed up by a roaming gang, that is the word that came to my mind, of Kettenhund men, SS men and pioneer troops, vicious-looking marauders who radiated a desperation to elude the Russian trap.